Hey everybody, welcome back to the Wisdom Tradition podcast. Once again, this is Alex Sacken, and today I have a episode that I've been working towards for a long time. It is part one of a two-part concluding episode to the Pythagoras series that I've been doing over the past couple months. And just to remind everybody, this series on Pythagoras is part of a larger series that I've been unfolding on my Substack, which is kind of like a blog. And this series is a chapter by chapter sort of serial publication of a book called Philosophy, Its Origin, Purpose, and Destiny. And so this multi-part series on Pythagoras is one of the chapters of this larger work. And after this chapter is concluded, then we're going to be going on and finishing up the remainder of the chapters. There's 5 or 6 left. So that'll be the project that we continue on for the foreseeable future in this podcast. And I hope you'll subscribe to the Substack so you'll get the articles when they come out. And if you're not subscribed, you can still go to that Substack. And the link is at my website, alexsacken.com. And you can find the whole series linked to on there. And you can find a link to my Substack. So you can just read the articles for free without subscribing. But I hope you'll subscribe and keep following the series because there's a lot of exciting and really interesting content to come. And I hope you've been enjoying everything that we've been doing so far and learning from it. So this is material that I spent years kind of compiling and putting together. So a lot of work has gone into the material that's in this book. So for today's episode, and I'm going to be recording these last 2 episodes back to back because I have everything written already. My initial plan was to have one final article, a part 4 of the series, which is the last part. But when I wrote it out, it was so long that I've cut it in 2. So this is going to be an episode that recaps certain information from our previous episode, which is part 3, in which we discussed the 3-4-5 triangle of Pythagoras. In this episode, we are going to revisit some concepts from the end of that episode, particularly the ones that have to do with the Pythagorean principle of the Pentad. The Pentad is the number 5, the philosophical meaning of the number 5. So the Pentad was something that we touched on at the end of that previous episode, and we associated it with Horus as part of the Osiris-Isis-Horus trinity of the ancient Egypt sect of the mysteries. So in this episode, we're going to be discussing and breaking down the significance of this number 5 and how it represents the universal form. And we're also going to be discussing the relationship between the universal form, or you could say the world form, meaning the whole, is associated with this number 5, but so is the soul of man as a microcosm of the whole. So we're going to be discussing the idea of microcosm and macrocosm and relating mankind and the world as a whole and comparing the two and using some of the language and some of the ideas from system science, which is what I started off in school and in grad school, and sort of the early work before I got deep into the esoteric philosophy, the early work that I did as part of the initial research and the initial just work and ideas I was putting together in my early 20s, again, before I got into the esoteric philosophy, that was all around system science and how system science relates to other schools of science and how it kind of represents a different paradigm almost. So we're going to be using some of the language of system science to go back over some of these ideas from the Pythagorean philosophy, and in this way try to form a bridge between ancient and modern thinking. So that's some of the goals for this episode. This one's relatively short compared to the next episode, which is longer. It's twice as long. And that episode is going to be on and that's the final episode of the series on Pythagoras. And that episode is on the topic of the golden section. And so the goal there is to give a basic introduction and overview of what the golden section is, or the golden ratio. And then we're going to try to work with it to relate it back to these key ideas that we've been discussing in terms of Pythagorean philosophy. So the materials are already written. I'm just going to be recording these 2 episodes back to back and posting them back to back. So I hope you'll listen to both of them. And that will conclude the series on Pythagoras. And then coming up, actually, we're going to be doing a chapter that's going to kind of try to synthesize this stuff with Pythagoras and then our previous content with Mahayana Buddhism. And it's going to be based around the Tetractys and exploring the Tetractys, which is a symbol from the Pythagorean sect. You can see I have a tattoo of it here on my arm, so that's what it looks like. to track this is something that we're going to be looking at from the standpoint of a mandala, and we're going to be talking about what some of the features are of Buddhist mandalas and how mandalas are used in general in esoteric philosophy as a meditational device. So the goal there is not to go into the details of how to do it, but what all the essential elements are and how they fit together. So to build a foundation, and then later on, for those further interested in the topic, you can build on this foundation to go deeper into the detail of how to construct a mandala and how to really disambiguate and break apart the elements of a mandala. So further details can be going on based on this chapter. I'm just going to try to introduce the main concepts. So, and also further use to track this as an excuse to further develop certain ideas from the Pythagorean system, ones that we haven't touched on in this current chapter. So that's really the last theoretical abstract, heavily abstract chapter in terms of getting into the fundamental elements of what esoteric philosophy teaches about the nature of the world and of mankind's place in the world. And then we're going to be picking back up with more of what we were doing in the early chapters of this book, which is building a narrative that comes up to present day and talks about the sort of descent and lineage of esoteric philosophy in relation to the larger term unfoldment of human history. So that's what we've been tracking in the early chapters, and then we got up to a point where we discussed the origin of philosophy, and now I've used Mahayana Buddhism and Pythagorean philosophy as two different case studies, and each of them tell us something about the meaning and purpose of philosophy. So that's why we're going into such detail in these two chapters, this current chapter and the previous chapter, and that's why we're going to be going into further detail in the next chapter. But after that, we're going to be picking back up and talking about things that are a little bit less abstract. We're going to be going into Plato. We're going to be going into Francis Bacon. We're going to be going into the secret history or the ancient history of the Americas and taking some lessons there. And we're going to be going to Los Angeles in the 20th century and looking at the life of Manly Hall that has its own chapter. And then finally, we're going to be looking at certain ideas about the Piscean age and the Great Year as our final conclusion. And so, yeah, I also just want to point out I do have two publications. Eventually, I want to get this book done as a written publication, an actual hard copy, but I do have two hard copy publications that are in my store. You can actually get the digital versions also. One is on depth psychology, which a lot of the material that we're covering in this book is in that book coming from a different foundation. So a lot of the points I've been making in this series on philosophy in that earlier publication and in the podcasts I did around that publication, a lot of the same essential ideas are covered, but they're covered from the foundation of depth psychology. But a lot of Manly Hall is in that book as well. So please check it out if you haven't yet, and check out those old episodes. And I also want to say that I have a publication called Atlantis and the Origins of Civilization, which is the first one that I did, but I'm really proud of it. And it gives a kind of sweeping overview of esoteric philosophy's view of the 7 ages of man. And it talks about previous ages and previous cycles, of which the Atlantis sort of history is part of a cyclical view of history. So Atlantis really represents a cycle, a previous cycle. And so in that publication, we talked about the transition between that older cycle and our current cycle, and how this current cycle fits into a larger pattern of one grand 7-cycle system. So that's a publication I recommend too if you haven't checked it out. And I will say one of the episodes I did for that, as part of that, the rollout for that book, which is about 40 pages, was an episode called The Atlantis Hypothesis, Manly P. Hall versus Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson and a couple other people. Anyway, that's by far my most downloaded episode on the podcast, and on YouTube it's one of my most downloaded. So it's a popular concept. I hope I've been able to, with that episode just alone, give people a different take on it than what they'll see in most other sources, which is not just the idea that there was an ancient civilization, but the idea that this view of an ancient civilization sort of shatters the linear Darwinian thinking of sort of our modern view of history. Instead brings back an entirely different cosmological scheme, and one that involves cycles and cycles within cycles. And so that's the real impact of the story of Atlantis, I just want to say. So with all that said, I want to jump into today's article. Again, it's part 4 of our series on Pythagoras, and it's called The Universe as a Supersystem. And so in this episode, we're going to be breaking down that article. Hope you stay tuned. And then, again, this will set the stage for part 5, which is on the golden section. So you'll definitely want to catch that one. Without further ado, let's get into it. All right, so the first section in part 4 is, I wrote it as a recap, but also to elaborate a bit further on where we ended part 3, which is called the number of creation. So that part 3 was really about the 3, 4, 5 triangle, and we ended with a discussion of the Pythagorean principle of the number 5, which is the Pentad, and how it relates to Horus. So I'm going to recap that to start off here with this present article, part 4, and then we're going to build off of that. So the article begins. Actually, before I go into that, I just have a picture here in the article of a depiction of this Pythagorean 3, 4, 5 triangle, and jutting out from each of the sides is the corresponding Egyptian deity. So we have Osiris corresponding to the length of the 3 side. We have Isis corresponding to the length of the 4 side. And then the 5-sided hypotenuse is the image of Horus. So let's begin. In the previous article of our continuing series on Pythagorean philosophy, i.e., in part 3, this present article being part 4, we introduced the idea that the universal form associated with the Pythagorean principle of the Pentad is generated from the interaction of deities' self-consciousness, which is the triad or the principle of 3, moving into and becoming conditioned by a cosmic mind or intellect, which is associated with the quaternary or the number 4. So here we find an important esoteric teaching restated in simple numerical terms, that self-consciousness is God's active yang or masculine attribute, self-consciousness being associated with the number 3, while mind or intellect, meaning the number 4, is God's passive yin or feminine attribute. So consciousness, number 3, is Osiris, and then mind or intellect is number 4, which is Isis. Neither principle exists independently of the other. Each requires its counterpart, just like that which is depicted in the classic yin-yang diagram of Taoism. So if you have the light, then you have to have the dark. So if you have the masculine, you have to have the feminine. And if you have the feminine, you have to have the masculine, and vice versa. So yang and yin co-define each other. Initially, before creation, these father-mother principles, yang and yin, were united in an undifferentiated state. Creation begins with their hypothetical separation, with self-consciousness, i.e. the father, separating to become the positive pole of creation, and mind, or the mother, situating itself as the negative or receptive counterpart. Here, the self, which is the triad, gives, and the mind, or the quaternary, receives. So one's active, one's passive, or one is receptive, and the active moves into that which is receptive, and it becomes shaped and contoured by it. So as it moves, it becomes shaped by it. So if number 3 representing the thing that's moving into it is consciousness in the form of a divine self, then that experience of self-consciousness is being shaped by mind, which is receiving it. And what it's being shaped into is the number 5, which is the universal form. So the form exists as this union of 3 and 4, or consciousness and mind. And so self-consciousness cannot exist without this mind that shapes the experience into an experience of selfhood. Selfhood has to be made because consciousness, the foundation of consciousness, is undefined or unbound. It is just unity. So to create an experience of self, you have to create a context within which that self-experience can be had. And so this divine trinity of Father, Mother, Child is describing how unity can have an experience of selfhood. And so the self and the not self becomes this mystery of duality, and then the self has to define itself in relation to the not self. And so that defining of the self requires this mind, this internal experience of mind, which partitions and structures and governs how consciousness is moving into experience. moving into an experience of itself. It's a guided experience. And the mother principle is what guides this experience. So that's why it's the intelligence, it's the intellect, because it has the law by which, or embodies the law by which this self-consciousness is going to take place. Thus, in the process of creation, the consciousness of the divine self, associated with 3, moves into the universal mind, which is its feminine Shakti, associated with the principle 4. Through this sacred union of the Triad, or Osiris, moving into and impregnating the Quaternary, or Isis, with its life-giving energy, a living, self-conscious life form, a divine self, or Horus, is conceived and born as an end result. Restating the above once more, the divine mind takes the divine self's consciousness and builds a universe or universal form for the consciousness of this divine self to inhabit and experience itself through. That's what I was trying to describe earlier. The form has to be built and designed for the consciousness to experience itself as a self through. So the self has to come as a product of something that lays the foundation for its own existence, and that foundation is consciousness and mind, or yang and yin, the father-mother principles. The universe that is formed out of the union between consciousness and mind is the child that they give birth to. So what we call a universe is actually the universal form. Our universe is this universal form. It was originally conceived and born as the child of consciousness and mind. It inherits its self-consciousness from the father and its intelligence from the mother. These qualities, consciousness and intelligence, are possessed by the universe at the level of the whole. They only exist within any given individual life form, such as a human, within the universe because they exist a priori at the level of the whole. Think about it. If these qualities were not initially held at the level of the universe, they could not be drawn upon and expressed on the localized level of the individual. Meaning, if the human is self-conscious, then the world and the universe as a whole must also possess this quality of self-consciousness. So think about the microcosm, your own body. Is there something that's true of an individual part of your body that's not true also of the whole? A vitality, a purposefulness, an intelligence? No, there's not. The whole, the part each part expresses an attribute of the whole, a potential that exists within the whole, and a part comes to express that potential and bring it into reality. So these things that we experience for ourselves, intelligence, consciousness, purposefulness, we could not have experiences of these principles on the individual level if we were not drawing from something that existed more fundamentally at the collective level. Because individuals come and go, but the innate design of things, the innate design of nature remains the same. So that innate design is held at the level of the whole, and then individual parts come and go. Just like in the human body, in the microcosm, they say that each cell recycles out of the body every 7 years. So the pattern of the body remains, but during the length of life, you'll have many different parts come into and out of your system. So the person you are when you die is not the same physical person that existed when you were younger, but the pattern is what is constant. So again, these are just applications of this idea of the archetype, the Platonic archetype, or the pure ideas, and that forms exist as expressions of these pure ideas. And the pure ideas exist at an innately collective or universal level, or at the level of the world soul. And they're gated into existence at the level of the individual, because individuals become receptive to these universal principles and then sort of channel or harness these principles into reality, or become instruments for the conversion of these potentials into kinetic energy, into action. And so that's what's happening. The individual is a receptive agent for a universal process. This is the way of thinking of esoteric philosophy. So just to conclude this paragraph, thus we must understand that the all-encompassing consciousness of deity is fully present within creation, never being absent anywhere. Likewise, the intelligence of deity, which manifests in the form of universal law, is also ever present. So these father-mother principles are ever present within the child principle. So to recap once more, within the universe, Consciousness is experiencing everything everywhere. And mind, meanwhile, designs, constructs, and weaves together this, quote, platform of experience that consciousness is moving into and inhabiting. Within the universe, consciousness is actively experiencing everything, and its awareness is universal. Meanwhile, the universal mind is everywhere, receiving this active power of consciousness and guiding it toward a lawful program of self-experience. So the two are like yin and yang. They go together. One is giving and one's receiving, or one's emanating and one is receiving. In this way, the consciousness of the divine self moving into the universe is being guided at all times by a matrix of universal law, which is ever present. The interplay between these two, which is consciousness and law, sets the stage for creation to unfold, with consciousness and law being the yang and yin principles that together lay the foundation for the universe's existence. Once more, the divine self, who is born as the child of consciousness and mind, is guided by the law conceived by mind, and this law is its mother, to direct consciousness, its father, into a highly purposeful and intelligently designed experience of universal selfhood. It is the purpose of the divine plan to guide consciousness into a dynamic experience of universal selfhood. I'm going to repeat that. It is the purpose of the divine plan to guide consciousness into a dynamic experience of universal selfhood. In this way, 3 and 4, or consciousness and mind, unite to generate 5, which is a divine self born through the world form, experiencing the world form in its entirety. And so it's undergoing a cycle of experience. And the cycle of experience is the story of that universal form evolving and growing to become a complete version of the archetype of itself. And that archetype is the divine plan. So in this way, the universal cosmology is just as the Pythagorean 3-4-5 triangle instructs us. It's Osiris, Isis, Horus. That is the cosmology, the one that becomes 3. So in sum, consciousness moves into mind to generate a cycle of self-experience. This experience of divine selfhood is cyclical. It is born in time as a unity moving into diversity, and it has an ultimate end state that it is working toward achieving, which is the dissolution of diversity back into unity, this marking the end of its life cycle. The cycle of existence is therefore purposeful. There is a divine intention and meaning behind God's motion to separate its yin and yang aspects in order that the universe may be born in this form of a grand cycle of self-experience. So the self exists to fulfill a meaning and a purpose and a plan. So that's the fundamental point to take away, is that this whole pattern that we're building with such certainty and such exactitude is kind of giving you an exact reason to have faith in the idea of purpose and the idea that there's a plan. Because while it sounds all very intellectual, the conclusion of it is that there is a purpose and a plan, and it's supposed to be inspiring for you to have faith, but also not blind faith, but an intelligent faith, a faith that's getting ever more precise and improved about what it is you're having faith in. And so that's what philosophy is guiding you towards religion, and is using science to do so. A scientific approach, an exactitude of thinking. But the point of the exactitude of thinking is to bring you to a higher state of religious understanding and religious experience. So that's what the mysteries, that's what initiation involves, the release of these higher states of spiritual religious experience. So by implication, life on Earth exists as a cycle within a cycle. It is a small part of a grander universal cycle of existence, one that Manly P. Hall calls the, quote, cycle of necessity. We should never forget that we are all, whether we choose to realize it or not, being purposely moved across the grand chessboard of life by the inevitable motions of this greater cycle. We are being moved by it, and the divine self as a whole is also being moved by it. Meaning that, like us, deity itself is being guided and led from an initial state to a final superior state by a precisely planned framework of law. This law weaves a matrix of self-experience that God, quote, falls into. This matrix of law is pulling God inevitably toward the attainment of a final evolutionary end state that is already preordained and predestined for it to one day achieve and experience. When God finally achieves this end state, after also experiencing and living through everything that led up to its achievement, then the present cycle of existence is concluded, resolved, and dissolved. Once this occurs, a cycle of rest ensues, what in Sanskrit is called pralaya, before at a future point a new cycle will begin on a higher plane of existence. So that's how the cycle view works. It's actually a spiral, but the cycle goes for a preordained time, for a preordained purpose, and when it concludes, it sort of resolves back into unity before all the elements involved in the old cycle are resurrected and put to work in a new cycle for a new challenge and a higher plane of existence. And mysteriously, everything comes together at the end for one great attainment of enlightenment by God. So that's the esoteric teachings. And that's the end of this chapter, that's the end of this section, which is the recap section called The Godhead as a Divine Family. And so the next section is going to be called The Universal Form as a Supersystem. So we'll pick back up there. All right, next section is once again called The Universal Form as a Supersystem. So I want you to pay attention to how I'm going to be linking the concepts that we're going to be talking about here. We're going to be talking about systems, subsystems, and supersystems. So we have three concepts there, all with the word system in it, but they all mean something different in relation to each other. So we're going to be comparing and contrasting these three elements, and in so doing, we're going to be going into how they form a triad that is consistent with the Pythagorean teachings on the topic of the triad. So to begin, I start the section by writing, the universe, once born, exists as a threefold entity, i.e. a trinity or triad. It possesses consciousness, inherited from its father, intelligence inherited from its mother, while also exhibiting itself as a grand archetypal form. Together, these three elements comprise the three worlds or domains that together constitute the soul. So again, the 3-4-5 triangle is talking about this triune nature of the soul, the world soul, which is crowned with spirit, and the spirit moves into matter, quote unquote, but matter is really this mystery, involved with this mystery of the mind. So it moves into mind and then becomes conditioned and expressed as a form, as a universal form. But this form is a living form. It's a living God that's in creation, that is creation. But this living God is supported by these father-mother principles, which are its parents. So together they make a trinity. In the language of system science, the universe, which represents the child principle of this trinity, is organized according to an archetypal design pattern modeled around what theorists in this field, meaning the field of system science, call a system. So the universe is organized according to a system, and what a system is it expresses an archetypal design scheme that all living forms exhibit. So because all things exhibit a common pattern, we call that pattern the archetype. So in this case, the word system is referring to an archetypal pattern. Now, not many people in this field of system science, if any, I don't think I've seen any reference the innate connection that the idea of a system has with the idea of the archetype that comes from both Plato and Jung. So it's clearly there. You can look at a solar system, a biological system, a social system, energetic systems of resource flow and nature, like the planetary system, galactic system. There's many different scales of a hierarchy of systems that scientists can observe and study and measure, but they all share a common design archetype in common. So that archetype is called the system. That's why we call them all systems. There are systems at different level, but the archetype is the common design scheme that they all share in common. So this is the application of Platonic thinking. It's embedded in system science for anybody waiting to be discovered by the very theorists who are doing this work. So they've been sort of recreating the thinking of the Platonic sort of ideals, but haven't really understood that that's what they're doing. So I may just call that out. This is what it is. System science is a sort of perfect ideal vehicle within the field of science that you can connect with this foundation from esoteric philosophy that has to do with this teaching of archetypes, which again are held within a universal state of existence. And so as we're going to see, this concept of supersystem is the idea that there's one whole system. There's a level of absolute wholeness to this system's concept. And that level of supersystem at the absolute level is what we call the universe. It's the one whole that contains all lesser parts. So let's get back into this system archetype. What does it mean? A system is a unit of wholeness that is internally comprised of an interconnected network of subsidiary parts. In a system, neither part nor whole can exist independently of its counterpart. The whole exists as a totality of parts, while each part is always nested alongside other parts within the overarching context of a whole. So that's a system. It's so simple. A system, whole parts. Parts come together to define a whole. Whole contains the parts and gives each part a meaning and a place and a purpose. So within the wholeness of a system, each part serves a purposeful function. Nothing is arbitrary or accidental. Each part is networked in some way with every other part. Together, these interlinked parts express the internal life pattern of the whole that is containing them. So parts exist to express the life of the whole. That's what they're given their meaning and place and purpose because of how they serve the whole. In the same way that the parts within your body all serve you as a whole, as a complete human organism. You need all the parts to function properly. Each part within a system is positioned into its designated role by the top-down organizing influence of the whole. In other words, diversity always exists in relation to a primordial wholeness. Without the wholeness binding the parts together from above, eventually entropy sets in and the various parts of the system break down and separate from each other. Exactly what happens to the human organism at death. The wholeness, which is the soul, is vivifying the body and giving its design and shape and holding the parts together as a whole. But when the soul departs from the body at death, then the various parts of the body start to break down from each other. They're not bound together anymore, so eventually they return to the earth, so to speak. And the only reason that they were sort of out of the earth and put into the form that is you is because that soul was binding them together. While each part within diversity holds relationships with a relatively confined network of other parts, all parts commonly share in having a direct personal and individual relationship to the whole. Each part is equally nested within the common whole. No one part can claim exclusive access to it. So each part has a relationship to other parts. Like each human has a relationship to other humans, but each human also has a relationship to God, just as all the parts also have a relationship to the whole. So God is the whole that contains all the parts. So everybody has a network of relationship to other human beings, but everybody shares in common having a personal, private, intimate relationship with God, which is the whole that contains all parts. This is the pattern of thinking. So again, the whole acts top down over the parts, guiding each part into its pre-designated place, purpose, role, and function. This attribute of purposefulness, where every part of the system plays a unique and specific role and function in relation to the whole, is the hallmark of the divine intelligence of the creator, whose archetypal design is imprinted in the system form. The archetypal design for creation manifests as the law for how this supersystem is designed to function, this idea of systems within systems. This pattern of divine law is permanently enthroned in the superior or heavenly world of archetypes, which is where what Plato termed pure or archetypal ideas are held by the universal mind. So the superior world is a universal world where things are existing, but they're existing in a universal state. So by implication, these archetypal ideas, which are inherently universal or collective, they're inherently collective, and they exist and are held within an innately collective domain of mind. So there is a individual mind that each of us possesses, but there's also a collective mind that exists top down at the level of the whole upon each of us, which is a part of the whole. So different individuals can access these archetypes or pure ideas, but no individual can claim exclusive ownership over them, as they are innately a product of the whole and not the part. Here, in this heavenly world or heavenly domain, reside the divine thoughts or archetypes, as well as the divine beings and enlightened humans who have evolved themselves to the point where they have become one with the law, never departing from its ways. So this is the part that's left out in depth psychology that you only will be able to incorporate as a student of esoteric philosophy, is the idea that the superior world is inhabited not only by gods, which is what these archetypes are referring to, the gods, so to speak, but also the quote, the demigods, who are the sort of enlightened, the hierarchy of enlightened humans that go beyond even sages of this present life wave, but involve this concept of bodhisattvas, or those who have perfected themselves in a previous cycle, but return to offer themselves as a service to this current cycle, the current project of a divine self moving into this solar system and inhabiting it and experiencing the whole life cycle of it. So again, this is a cycles-based view of reality. But let's return to the paper. All right, so we were just talking about the superior level of archetype or pure idea, pure spirit. So now, by contrast, the inferior domain of material creation, which is what we are a part of here on Earth, is a realm where law still rules supreme, but the living, growing, and evolving life forms incarnating here have not yet learned and mastered its ways. Thus, the law is manifested in this realm imperfectly. So it still rules supreme, but it's manifested imperfectly, which is why this is a realm where karmic retribution is taking place as a consequence of this imperfect action. So this is particularly true in the life of man, where through our faculty of self-will and personal choice, we often choose, largely due to our own ignorance, which we are gradually overcoming, but we often choose to go against the way of the law in order to pursue and grasp for our own egoistic desires and beliefs. So this underworld or inferior world is a world of imbalanced forces. As long as mankind remains imbalanced, he is continuously moved by these forces. But as he learns to master the control of these forces within himself, he simultaneously learns the key to balancing all imbalances in his greater environment, or in the greater environment around him. So that's basically the idea of alchemy, is that the great experiment must first be performed on yourself, and then by performing itself, you learn the key to performing it in the world as a whole. So returning back to our main topic, which is the overarching grand systemic design of the universe, let's restate the main thesis we're working with. When the universal form is born from the union of the father-mother principles that initially conceived it, it emerges as a grand universal system, or what system scientists call a supersystem. The universal supersystem is singular. It is one cumulative totality that exists as a single ultimate wholeness. Within this singular wholeness, all subsidiary systems, forms, structures, processes, motions, and dynamics, from the galaxy to the human to the molecule, are nested as parts within a whole. Thus, there are many systems, but only one supersystem. Always, one macrocosmic wholeness embeds all subsidiary parts, nesting each into its proper place, role, and function. This singular wholeness is the supersystem, the system of systems. Within this supersystem, a vast internal hierarchy of systems within systems is nested, with each planet, solar system, and galaxy existing as such a system. Each on its own scale, a system. This means that each on its own scale is a system, meaning that it holds within itself an internal network of lesser systems or subsystems, while at the same time being embedded within the inner life of one or more greater systems, each existing as a relative supersystem above it. So within the supersystem, all lesser systems are embedded. So each lesser system will have some other systems within it that are subsystems, and it will be a part of some systems above it, which are supersystems. But all of it, at all levels, no matter what scale, they're all contained within one ultimate wholeness, which is the absolute supersystem. So within this nested hierarchy of systems within systems, all contained within the singular universal supersystem, a three-part organizational schema is exhibited. In relation to any given system existing within the supersystem, there will be A, some systems existing alongside it as peers. B, there will be other lesser systems that are nested internally as subsystems. And C, there will also be a hierarchy of systems above it, each of which will embed that first system as one of their own internal parts, thus making that system one of their subsystems. So each system will play in relation to other systems, depending on which one you want to look at. It could play either the role of a system, meaning a fellow system, held within one common supersystem. So it can play the role of system, it can play the role of supersystem in relation to the lesser systems within itself. Like the body, you could say the human being is a supersystem in relation to each individual cell existing in the body. So this human body is a system in compared to other humans, and it's a supersystem in comparison to its own cellular structure. But you could also say it's a subsystem in relation to the whole, into the human collective. So the human being plays all three parts. So the human being is an ideal example of a system because it has this property. From this discussion, we can see that there are two types of supersystems. One absolute, the other relative. The absolute supersystem is the one universal wholeness that holds all other systems within itself as parts. A relative supersystem, however, is a system that is held within the absolute supersystem as one of its parts, I guess I would say. In relation to a hierarchy of lesser systems or subsystems that it holds within its nature, a given system may play the role of supersystem in relation to these lesser systems, like I just said, with the human body as the example. So in this case, the status of a system being labeled a supersystem is granted relatively. A system may be a supersystem in relation to some systems, but not others. On one level, they may be a supersystem to the lesser systems they embed within themselves as parts, but on another level, that same system may actually play the role of subsystem for an even larger cosmic system. For example, our solar system is the supersystem within which our planet is embedded as a part, but in relation to the galaxy, this solar system is a mere subsystem, a tiny part of a yet vaster cosmic wholeness. So this fractal pattern of nesting, i.e. of systems within systems, continues upward until the level of absolute supersystem, which is the universe, is reached. This is the level of unity, where there is one complete wholeness embedding all lesser parts within the infinite vastness of its own being. Having discussed the level of absolute supersystem, let's now introduce a counterposing domain, that of absolute subsystem. So the universe is absolute supersystem. Let's look at absolute subsystem. And that can be found at the level of atoms. So the atom is the smallest unit of life that demonstrates the system archetype's hallmark part-whole relationship. While individual atoms contain lesser substructures or parts within themselves, these lesser parts do not exist stably as wholes in their own right. In other words, subatomic structures together comprise the atom as a system, but each is not individually a system in its own right, meaning it doesn't fulfill the qualifications. But above the level of the atom, like at a level of a molecule, the subsystems that comprise the molecule, those subsystems are atoms. And so those atoms, though they're subsystems of the molecule, they themselves still qualify to be called systems. But once you reach the level of the atom, the internal structures of the atom no longer qualify to independently be called systems. So that's why the level of atom is the nadir of this process. It's the level of absolute subsystem. All material forms above the atom are built upon the foundation of atoms. Conversely, as absolute subsystems, atoms are always existing and coming into formation in relation to greater systems that embed them and position them into place. So the atoms are the building blocks of creation. That's an intuitive idea that we know from school, but it's true in the specific language of system science because they're the smallest unit of system. They're the absolute subsystem. So all structures within this world of universal form are exist because how they assemble atoms together to form themselves. So the atoms are the sort of nodal points that all the designs are crafted out of. At the highest level, all atoms, as well as all greater systems built from atoms, exist within a single universal field of consciousness and intelligence. This field is the level of the supersystem, which circumscribes and embeds all lesser systems within itself, from the galaxy to that of the single hydrogen molecule. And then just again, comparing and contrasting these two levels, that of the universe and that of the atom. While the universe or supersystem implies singularity, there being only one, atoms imply plurality. Atoms always exist in relation to other atoms, which they form relationships with. In short, atoms are many, but the universal supersystem is always one. In between these two extremes, the level of absolute supersystem and the level of absolute subsystem is extended a vast hierarchical network of systems within systems. So the whole framework of systems and relative subsystems and relative supersystems, this all exists within this innate polarity between the absolute supersystem and the absolute subsystem. So you can see there's 5 tiers. There's the 2 levels of absolute, and we can associate these with the father-mother principles. And then we have in between them a 3rd level, which is the level of the soul. And the soul is this tiered hierarchical structure that binds these 2 opposing polarities together. And this intermediate level, the level of the soul, which is the level of the system, we find the pattern that embeds it recapitulated within itself. So within itself, you'll find this relative ranking of supersystems, systems, and subsystems, but all of that exists within this intermediate level between the absolutes, the absolute supersystem and the absolute subsystem. So when you sum together the 2 absolutes and then the intermediary, which is a 3-part intermediary, we have the number 5. And that's what we've been working with, the pentad. So just to recap once more, within this supersystem, each individual system is always enmeshed in a triangulated pattern of relationship, meaning A, each system is comprised of an internal network of lesser systems or subsystems. Each system exists in relation to a hierarchy of yet greater supersystems, which embedded as a part within their greater systemic wholeness. And C, each system is nested beside and dynamically intertwined with a network of other systems who share in common the fate of being embedded within a common supersystem. Each system is intelligently designed and placed within the being of a greater supersystem in order to perform a specific role and function in relation to its parent, in relation to this parent system. So that's what gives each part or each system has a meaning in relation to the whole that it is a part of. In this way, each system is positioned into place from above. Then within itself, it similarly positions an inner network of lesser subsystems, which also experience its influence upon them as if from above. The goal for the system is to find an internal design expression that matches the role and responsibility specified for that system by the larger supersystem that embeds it. The design of the internal thus must match and harmonize with the design of the external. So the system in relation to its subsystems tries to match that design with the supersystem and how that supersystem contains this system within itself alongside other systems. So the system is relating to other systems alongside it in the effort of performing its proper role and function in relation to the whole. And then part of the way it does that, part of the way that it finds its way and perfects itself in its role, is to mediate an internal network of parts or subsystems. So we have this 3-part relationship, and this proportion that I'm going to say right now is what we're going to revisit in the next episode, having to do with the golden section or golden ratio. But the relationship of the supersystem to the individual system is the same as the relationship of the individual system to its lesser subsystems. So the greater is to the intermediary as the intermediary is to the lesser. And that is what the golden ratio is. But not to get ahead of ourselves, I want you to see where this is going. So we're talking about the system's design, but we're being very, very precise in how we're laying it out, and we're emphasizing triangles, triangulation. Now, as a final paragraph for this section, I just have just to revisit the 5-part scheme that we're talking about. We just talked about. So as a last section here, I again point out this 5-part organizational scheme. I write, overall, note that when it comes to systems dynamics, we're dealing with a 5-part organizational scheme. The foundation of the scheme is the polarity between absolute supersystem and absolute subsystem. These form the boundary conditions for the world system to form. Within the world system emerges an intermediate state, or an intermediary state, that of systems within systems. Here we find a hierarchy of systems existing in relation to one another. As part of this hierarchy, each system finds itself embedded in a 3-part organizational scheme, one that imitates in miniature the design of the supersystem as a whole. Here we find each system linked to a relative hierarchy of lesser subsystems on one level, greater supersystems on another level, and then other systems like themselves as existing as peers to it on their own level. So we'll have a system will be surrounded by some systems that are peers and then some below and some above. So it's a 3-part scheme. Added together, this 3-part framework of systems within systems, plus the 2 boundary states of absolute subsystem and absolute supersystem, yields 5 total levels of systemic organization and order. Remember, 5 is a number of the universal form. It is notable that the innate reasoning of system science, a field attempting to describe the archetypal organizational pattern being expressed by the universal form, fits into an ancient pattern of philosophical thinking taught by the Pythagoreans. So there's a reason I'm going through all this language of systems, because it fits into this ancient teaching, if you think about it. I just want to point out, I'm not taking this discussion on systems and the links between this and the Pythagorean philosophy and esoteric philosophy. I'm not taking that from anywhere. This is my own original synthesis. The systems view and this relationship of systems within systems is something I put together 10 years ago, or more even. And then as I went into esoteric philosophy, I always read the material with an eye for how does it help me explain and understand this idea of systems. So this is, in a sense, what I concluded, how they fit together. So let's look at a case study, or 2 case studies, Earth and man as systems. This is the next section. In ecological terms, we can gain an intuitive grasp of the dynamics involved with the system archetype, discussed above, by considering how life exists here on Earth. Ecologically, the Earth is an interconnected supersystem in which life, consciousness, energy, information, and resources interact, flow, and are exchanged at the level of the whole. Every continent and climatic region of the Earth plays a unique and important role in facilitating the overall flow of life energy here on this planet. Without each region playing its part, the overall design of the supersystem would break down and the planet would experience sickness as a composite wholeness. So all the parts would be affected as this sickness that would inhabit the whole. And that's kind of what we're experiencing today with ecological disaster, ecological collapse, is this idea of a global sickness setting in from us allowing, through our own ignorance and our own greed and selfishness, allowing the parts of this system to break down as individual parts, like the rainforest, for example. So that's what happens at the level of the whole, and then that level of the whole, the sickness at the level of the whole, feeds back into each of the parts and makes the situation worse. So that's just an example of how the systems thinking works in practice. Each continent and or climactic region of the Earth exists as a semi-autonomous system nested within the greater Earth supersystem. As such, while each is a part of the Earth ecosystem, which is the whole, each is also on its own level a miniature supersystem in its own right, one that embeds an internal hierarchy of lesser systems within its sphere of influence as lesser parts of its own microcosmic wholeness. For example, a rainforest ecosystem exists as a miniature supersystem in that a dynamic internal hierarchy of lesser systems, species, organisms, etc., come together to provide all the elements necessary to keep that rainforest ecosystem thriving and functional at the level of the whole. So this is the application of systems thinking to the Earth ecosystem. Zooming in now to the level of the human species, we find the system archetype present once again. Each individual human organism is a microcosmic supersystem comprised of an internal hierarchy of lesser subsystems, which are embedded within itself as parts within a whole. At the same time, each individual human is also a subsystem within a greater social ecosystem, where it forms a part of a larger social, political, and economic community alongside other individual humans like themselves. These smaller communities, tribes, nations, and states, each a miniature supersystem in its own right, has in the course of time become linked to others like itself, such that gradually each social community is becoming networked together to become a local part within a single collective whole, which is global civilization. So while each community is itself a miniature system and has subsystems within itself, each is also linked to other communities like itself as part of this dynamic where each is also a subsystem within a greater supersystem, which is the collective global civilization. So that's what's happening in our age. Now, previously, if you think back to the pagan era, this is when civilizations were being connected back together, but the linkages were not like they are today, such that civilization zones did exist independently. We can't say there was a world nation at that earlier point. But today we can say it's a world nation. So individual communities that used to be independent autonomous states or independent autonomous super systems on their own level now are connected together and linked together to form these larger and larger entities, countries, nations, economic blocks, political zones, things like that. And then gradually, even on that level, that's being integrated together to form a global nation. And the global nation doesn't just exist as an aggregate of individual countries and parts, but the global nation won't fully be formed until it has its own autonomous influence over the whole, even the level of countries and nations, that it'll have a autonomous existence at the level of the whole. Because that's what the human anatomy as the microcosm is. We don't have a situation in which the different organs are competing against each other for influence over the whole. They're all supposed to harmoniously work together such that the whole person can be given the fullest opportunity to express their own potentials through. So that's the same in the microcosm in terms of human society as a collective. So the world nation as it forms becomes this single overarching supersystem which embeds all elements of human life, both individual and collective, within itself in a nested hierarchy of systems-based relationship. At the nadir of the human supersystem, i.e. at its atomic level, is the individual human. At the other extreme, meaning at its apex, is an innately collective sphere of human existence that Jung termed the collective unconscious, and which sociologists analyze and reference by the name of institutions. So institutions and the collective unconscious alike are innately collective and not individual realms. This is also the realm of Platonic archetypes, i.e. of innately collective ideas which exist as a common heritage for all members of the human species to experience and draw from. And then let's just go into this a little bit further. So let's take a moment to explore further how the findings of depth psychology further validate this systems-based approach to analyzing the social and psychological dynamics of human life. In particular, through Jung's concepts of the collective unconscious and the archetypal elements that reside therein, we find expressed the notion that individual humans are psychologically embedded within a shared collective psychic atmosphere, this being the collective unconscious. So this realm of the collective unconscious exists as a single shared supersystem of psychic activity, one that impacts and influences all humans top down from the level of the whole. So you see this part-whole dynamic is interwoven into Jungian psychology, this systems view. As we can see from this discussion, in the same way that each individual human organism contains within itself a descending hierarchy of organs, tissues, and cells, the human species as a whole contains nations, cities, economies, companies, governments, and individuals within itself, each embedded in a descending hierarchy of systems within systems, of parts relating to each other, all embedded within a single supersystemic unity. Both are alike, the individual and the collective, because both are designed according to a common framework, the system archetype. This archetype extends from mankind into nature as a whole, and from nature upward to the solar system as a whole. Everywhere in nature we look, we find one common archetype of interconnection binding all things together. So that's the conclusion of this section. And now we have one more to go, and it's called Microcosm and Macrocosm, a Systems View. And that'll conclude this part 4 of this series on Pythagoras. All right, final section, Microcosm and Macrocosm, a Systems View. In the esoteric teachings, mankind and the world as a whole are defined as analogs of one another, man being the microcosm and the world the macrocosm. In this teaching, the universe is like the world, and the world is like man. With our consideration of the system's archetype, we find a modern confirmation of this ancient teaching. Both the world and man are alike because each is patterned according to a common archetypal design. The implication of this is that the world, i.e. the global Earth supersystem we are embedded in, is like a grand man, while man, i.e. the collective human species, is a little world. Likewise, the collective human species exists like a grand man, while each individual human exists as a miniature microcosm of the whole that it is a part of. The profound truth revealed in this perspective is that there is an analogical design to how the entire hierarchy of creation is constructed. This self-similarity in design allows for the principle of resonance to be established among systems existing at all scales of creation. Similarity in design between two systems means that a harmonic resonance can be established between them, such that the similar elements that each share in common can be stimulated to vibrate in synchronization with each other. This type of resonance creates a bond between them, one that allows them to unite their inner dynamics together. In this way, systems at various scales of creation can link together and act as one. This truth is the basis of spirituality. The idea that through mastery of the disciplines of philosophy, the individual can attain resonance with the consciousness of a greater supersystem above it, and even up to the level of the universal supersystem itself. This resonance goes all the way up. And this way, the individual can awaken his personal consciousness to the universal consciousness of the whole, i.e. of the divine self, again, through this pattern of resonance. Again, this experience of universal awakening is possible because there is a similitude between man as part and the world as a whole. Bringing things back full circle, through this mechanism of self-similar design and energetic resonance, the unified consciousness of deity flows into creation and inhabits a hierarchy of differentiated life forms. In so doing, it obtains an almost infinite diversity of experiences for itself to have and be stimulated by. God the Mother is responsible for designing this hierarchical matrix of self-experience, while God the Father is the singular divine consciousness that moves into, inhabits, and experiences this matrix of differentiated life forms. God the Child, meanwhile, is this universal self who manifests its being into creation in the form of a universal supersystem. This universal supersystem is born at the beginning of creation. Creation takes place within it as a vast cycle, a vast process where this supersystem grows and develops into, at the end, a perfect expression of its own archetype. Within the master life cycle of the supersystem, all lesser systems, cycles, life, processes, and experiences of self-existence are embedded, again, like parts within a whole. The grand cycle of creation comes to completion when the universal supersystem achieves the fullness of its evolution, as specified by its own divine archetype. For this final evolutionary state to be attained, each part within it must individually achieve the completeness of its own evolution as a microcosm of the whole. Thus, the macrocosm and microcosm are alike. What the universe experiences as a whole, each individual system within it will experience as an individual part. And that's this journey of becoming identical with the archetype of its own being, its own existence. The perfect pattern that was conceived in the beginning by the mother, the form and the fullness of time evolves to become a perfect expression of that design. In both cases, the microcosm or macrocosm, in both cases, the task is to fulfill the grand design of evolution, where each individual and the collective as a whole evolves itself to the point where it can bring into perfect expression the initial archetypal design that the universal mind originally intended for it. So that's the end of this part 4, and this brings to conclusion this miniature discussion of the systems view and how it relates to the Pythagorean principle of the triad and the pentad. And so I hope this was valuable. And this all sets the stage now for us to go to our last part 5, which is on the golden section. And we'll be visiting these themes involved with the triad and the pentad once more. So thank you for tuning in and for following this discussion to this point. And I hope this is valuable. And God bless. Take care.